Good evening, everybody, and welcome to my humble home. This is going to be quite easy, actually. I love the Ministry of Defence. Oh, what? Can everybody see me and hear me okay? I was having some problems with my webcam earlier. So if you're in the chat, please let me know that you're there. Really? Can you hear me, Rob? No problem. Can everybody hear me okay? I'm having some problems with my webcam, so hello. Welcome to my humble home. Tonight's going to be really interesting. I absolutely love the Ministry of Defence. They are such a well-oiled machine. Thank you, Wayne. They have rules and regulations. They have policies and procedures. And they have standing orders. Oh, I love the Ministry of Defence because they have made my life so much easier. Everybody knows, and I hope everybody that's watching today knows a little bit about this case and what happened with the helicopters hovering low over people's homes. You know, we've got witnesses that looked out their bedroom windows and were literally eyeballing the pilots of the helicopters. How these helicopters kept people awake, it hit the mainstream media. And they broke just about every aviation rule going that night. But their biggest mistake was this happened over private land, not over Ministry of Defence land. And I have been doing some light reading for you, just a little bit of the policies and procedures required for training over private land, not Ministry of Defence land. And just because they want to train on private land doesn't mean they can. They must get written permission from the landowner, and all land in the UK is owned by somebody, and in these cases it was the Rhondda Cynon Taf local authority and National Resources for Wales, but we'll get into that. Okay, now I found some rather interesting documents, and you must let me know if you want me to read the full thing, but the biggest one that I found, which is this very small document here, which is Training Over Private Land, Ministry of Defence. In fact, it's the DIO, or the Defence Infrastructure Organisation, which are the people that are in charge of absolutely everything. And as you know, and as I have heard, there have been some alternative stories going around that this was just a military exercise by what I call my not so learned friends, because they really should read up on the rules and regulations as I have. And there's a few things that they have to do in order to put in an application to train on private land. You know, units must pay particular attention to the prevention of noise, for example, especially during what they call silent hours, so as not to inconvenience civilians. And I think they must have overlooked that one. Anyway, this application has to be completed before it is submitted. Exercises are not to be planned. I'll repeat that. In fact, I'll read it. Exercises are not to be planned in areas where disturbance would be caused to local inhabitants in their homes. This is from the Training Over Private Land Act, Section 41. I'll get into the sections a little bit later. They must have written permission received from the landowner prior to any application. Okay, well, as we know, National Resources for Wales and the Rhondda Cynon Taf are the landowners in question. And we've already had some Freedom of Information requests back from them. And the Rhondda Cynon Taf told us this: "We refer to your Freedom of Information request in respect of the incidents on the night of the 25th and 26th of February 2016, which involved the supposed military exercise which took place in the area of Llantrisant Common to Pentyrch, in an area which the Royal Glamorgan Hospital and the Royal Mint are located. The authority was not made aware of any exercises in these areas on those dates." That's Rhondda Cynon Taf. But National Resources for Wales went one step further, and they said, "There was no permission granted to the military to close the woodland, the public paths, and let off explosives in the woodlands mentioned during these dates, or in fact, any dates. So we have no records. This type of activity would have required permission, so if it had occurred, we would have had a record. Therefore, Regulation 12.4a, Environmental Information Regulations 2004 applies. No information is held." So they didn't know either. So they certainly did not get written permission from the landowner. And without any written permission from the landowner, the application was never completed. They must also have written permission from a landowner to land their aircraft on private land. The only place they can land their aircraft are on military defence land or in airports allocated to the Ministry of Defence. This is another one. They must liaise with the public. Well, funnily enough, nobody knew anything. The press, well, they didn't know anything either. In fact, we have a comment from the press. We haven't subjected those yet to a Freedom of Information request, but that's coming. And the press said at 3:39 a.m. on the morning of the 26th of February 2016 that they were still working on a story. And we will post the link as soon as we have it. So they didn't know anything either. They must liaise with local government. Well, they didn't know anything. National Resources for Wales, they didn't know anything. The Farmers Union and the police prior to any exercise taking place. These are musts, and this is why I love the military, because they work to the letter, by the letter, without exception. These orders are not negotiable. You're not in your local auction room house where you can debate it. You have to do it. They follow the rules. A full risk assessment must be done according to the Home Health and Safety Executive. That wasn't done either. A full written environmental survey must be completed. That wasn't done either. And a full recce of the area must be completed, including maps and routes. And that wasn't done either. And all this must be completed and received before any application to train over private land can be granted. And even then, it might not be. And I think it's clear just from this very small list that the application for training over private land was never completed and therefore never granted. The Armed Forces Act 2006, Chapter 52, I'll get there now, and they govern low-level flying heights. Section 34, low flying, subsection 105, the Defence Council makes regulations governing heights for flying. Subsection 106, in some situations, such as training, an individual who's flying an aircraft may be under the command of another. If the person flying the aircraft breaches minimum height requirements on the orders of such a person, it is the person in command who commits the offence. Section 35, Annoyance by flying. Subsection 107 of the Armed Forces Act 2006, Chapter 52. This section is intended to prevent flying which is excessively intrusive or otherwise likely to annoy members of the public. Well, funnily enough, there were a few thousand people that were annoyed that night. It is an offence if a service personnel fly an aircraft as to annoy or likely to annoy any person. If flying in question is carried out on the orders of a person who is not actually flying, it is the person in command who commits the offence. And there are multiple offences. I will continue just very quickly on what they say about minimum heights on low-level flying exercises. In the Armed Forces Regulation RA 2330, low flying, paragraph 4, section 44A, fixed-wing aircraft should not overfly a residential area below 2,000 feet. Well, I can guarantee the two C-17s that flew over my head were lower than 2,000 feet. 44B, rotor wing air systems such as helicopters should not overfly congested or residential areas under 1,000 feet. But they were hovering over people's homes. Somebody lost the tops of their trees in their garden because they were hovering so low. The 3 Apache helicopters that I saw, one above 2, were certainly very low. You could see all the hedges and all the grass being pushed flat by the force of their rotor wings. And section 44C, all other air systems should not overfly congested or residential areas below 1,000 feet. These are the Armed Forces regulations. Separation distances are also relevant here. J2330 subsection 110. The minimum safe separation distance for a fixed-wing aircraft is 250 feet. The 2 C-17s that flew over my head were wingtip to wingtip. They were not 250 feet apart. And the minimum safe separation distance for rotor wing air systems is 100 feet. The 3 Apache helicopters were next to each other. They were not 100 feet apart. This one I've added because it will become relevant and clear as I go on. On Regulation 2330, paragraph 3, the use of identification friend or foe, IFF, or secondary surveillance radar systems, SSR, transponders. Their air system should not fly low without a serviceable IFF or SSR transponder. And then we have section 2330 again of the Armed Forces Act, avoidance areas. Don't you just love the Ministry of Defence? They have orders and they don't change. They're not temporary, they're permanent. And I'll get into the avoidance areas because you're going to love this. I did. Okay, so these are the things that they are not permitted to do. I've already read this, but I'll read it again because I think it's wholly important. Exercises are not to be planned in areas where disturbance would be caused to local inhabitants in their homes. This is contrary to Regulations for Training Over Private Land Act, section 41. The military are not permitted to fly below 1,000 feet over residential areas. This is contrary to aviation law of the Armed Forces Act 2006, section 34, subsections 105, 106 and 107 that I have just read. And it's also contrary to Regulation 2334, 44A, 44B and 44C. They are not permitted to fly within the minimum safe separation distances, but they did that night. Contrary to Joint Services Publication Regulations 2330, section 110. Use of identification, friend or foe, IFF or secondary radar transponders are a must, especially when they low fly. And the transponders that night were switched off when the operation started, so we couldn't track them on radar, but they were there. And that's contrary to Regulations 2330, paragraph 3, subsection 21. I can't tell you how many laws they broke that night, but I calculate at least 20, and that's individually. let alone how many times they broke those laws. They are not permitted to land their aircraft on private land without prior written permission, and we know that no such permission was ever granted. And that's contrary to the Regulations for Training Over Private Land Act, Section 6. And also, contrary to the aviation law, landing and taking off within a congested or residential area or near open air assemblies. That's Section 5.1. An aircraft must not take off or land within a residential area of any city, town or settlement. But they did that night, when they landed their choppers and their Chinook helicopters on Llantrisant Common without permission. They are not permitted to use pyrotechnics or munitions on private land without prior written permission. Now, by their own admittance, the Ministry of Defence, in their wisdom and in their Freedom of Information request, told us no live ammunition was used. Exercise and troops were issued with blank simulated ammunition, which mimics the sound of firing without any projectile and exiting their weapons. And they also went on to say the explosions were controlled detonations of simulated munitions to assist the exercise. They didn't have permission. Nobody gave them permission to train over private land. And that is a must for any application for an exercise on training on private land. And as I say, just because they want to doesn't mean they can. Okay, this is for my not so learned friends, as I call them, that I've put out the story that what I saw were flares, okay? Because they are not permitted, I'll repeat that, they are not permitted to use red flares for any training purpose on private land. They are not allowed to do it. There is one condition: only in an emergency. And that's contrary to Training Over Private Land Act, Section 30D. They're also not permitted to low fly over a population of more than 10,000 people. When I checked, the population of Llantrisant is over 15,000. That's not including the population of Beither or Pontyclun or Llantwit Major or Penarth or Llanharan or any of these other places that they flew over. They are not allowed to low-level fly over a population of more than 10,000 people. But they did that night. And that is contrary to the MOD avoidance policy. And I'll get into the avoidance policy because you're going to love this. I certainly did. They are not permitted to low fly within a controlled airspace of a civil airport. Well, I'm sorry. Cardiff International is just up the road, where their Apache helicopter had to do an emergency landing with its cockpit on fire. So what were they doing in an area where there's a civil airport? The only reason they would be there is because this is a real situation, not an exercise. But it gets better. They're also not allowed to fly near medical facilities. Medical facilities. The Royal Glamorgan Hospital was right there. Right there. And finally, they're not allowed to fly over certain industrial facilities. The Royal Mint sits on an industrial estate and other key establishments. Those key establishments are royal households. And that's contrary to the MOD's own avoidance policy. They are not permitted to fly within 3 nautical miles of a NOTAM boundary, or within 500 feet of the upper limit. And that's inside of the boundary. But they exceeded the NOTAM boundary by over 50 miles that night. And that is contrary to military exercise and training areas, the UK MIA AIP ENR 522 section 5227D. My word, I've done some reading for you guys this week. They did not adhere to the country code, which they must do. And I know that sounds irrelevant, but I'll get there. The country code, section 10, to keep the noise and interference to an absolute minimum, particularly in the vicinity of dwellings and livestock, especially in lambing season. Well, I wonder how many farmers lost their sheep that night. And that's not a joke. This is how people make their living. If a sheep is worried, the reason why sheep worrying is a crime is because when sheep get scared, they abort their fetus. And this was on lambing season. Right on lambing season. And no one was told anything. They are not permitted to close the footpaths. They're not permitted. If you want to walk up the footpath in the middle of one of their exercises, you can. You want to smell the flowers and have a picnic while they're firing blanks at each other, you're more than welcome to do so. It's contrary to the Public Right-of-Way Act 2000. If a public right-of-way crosses an area of private land, the footpath must remain open. There is no legal mechanism to close a public right-of-way for an exercise. It is also a breach of your statutory rights. Statutory rights are an individual's legal rights given to him or her by the local and national ruling government. These are usually designed to protect civilians, and they are typically enforced by local enforcement. Oh my God, South Wales Police. And their violation usually carries a penalty of legal prosecution and punishment. But they did. They closed the footpaths and the roads going into Smilog Woods. Uniformed police prevented people from going through there. This was not an exercise. And that's contrary to regulations for Training Over Private Land Act, Section 25H1, Public Access. And also contrary to the Joint Services Publication Regulations 362, Volume 2, Leaflet 6, 2.6.18. They did not liaise with the public, National Resources for Wales. They did not liaise with the press. They did not liaise with local government or with the Farmers Union of Wales, without which no application for training over private land would have ever been granted. Contrary to the regulations for Training Over Private Land Act 1C, 15I and 15K. They must pay particular attention to noise levels in silent hours. In silent hours. But at 4:30 in the morning they're conducting a meticulous metal search in the middle of Llantrisant Common, in the middle of a residential area. There was no care for people in silent hours. As contrary to regulations for Training Over Private Land Act, Section 37D. There were no risk assessments, as contrary to regulations of Training Over Private Land Act, Section 40A, and also contrary to the regulations of the Joint Services Publication 362, Volume 2, Leaflet 6, 2.6.22. No conservation and environmental written survey, which has to be done. The adjacent land is actually owned by E. Guerra, which is a trust, and there are protected species that live there, namely the skylark. Contrary to regulations for Training Over Private Land Act, Section 37A and 37B, and also contrary to regulations of the Joint Services Publication 362, Volume 2, Leaflet 6, 2.6.14. There was no ministerial briefing or press briefing, something they have to do for an exercise. And that's contrary to regulations for Training Over Private Land Act Section 15I and 15J. Identification. It is their duty, and they must, repeat, must, identify themselves if asked to do so with their name, rank and unit number. Any persons questioning service personnel on private land must be presumed that they have the valid reason for doing so. Therefore, the utmost courtesy must be extended to them. Parties of service personnel or individuals are not to avoid any person attempting to question them. As contrary to regulations for training over Private Land Act, Section 26B. They lied to us. They told us they were Vodafone. And when Gary and I asked who these people were, we were told Section 26, not in the public interest. So again, prepared to breach their own regulations, their own orders, in order to cover this up. Making false statements. Under the Armed Forces Act of 2006, Chapter 52, Section 18, making false statements. It is an offence of improper conduct. Improper conduct, as defined in Section 76, 1. Making an official record, knowing or having reasonable cause to believe that it is an official record, and being aware that it is false in a material respect. And 77, under the same Section 18, the offence under subsection 1 also applies to any person who adopts a record made by someone else which he knows to be false. This would include signing a record made by another as to confirm its accuracy. But we know they lied. We've caught them out lying to us on multiple occasions via their Freedom of Information requests. In summary, and this is outrageous, they had no written permission to train over private land. They had no written permission to land an aircraft on private land. They broke aviation law multiple times in both minimum heights and regulations of separation distances. They ignored the avoidance policy. They ignored the silent hours order. They ignored the Public Rights of Way Act. They ignored the Countryside Code. They ignored the NOTAM boundary. They ignored regulations about low-level flying over a residential area with more than 10,000 people in it. There is no risk assessment. There is no written environmental assessment. They did not liaise with the police, with the public, with the press, with local government, with the National Resources for Wales, with the Farmers Union, without which any application for training over private land would never have been granted. It didn't exist. It just didn't exist. They have lied on Freedom of Information requests and made false records, which is an offence of improper conduct, not becoming a serviceman of the United Kingdom Armed Forces. They did not identify themselves when asked to do so. They lied about who they were. This was not a training exercise. Training didn't even come into this. Be under no illusion, this was a real combat operation. The only reason they were here was because the UFOs were here. If they were going to do an exercise, they could have done one in Sennybridge, which is only 40 miles away. They knowingly and expectantly set an ambush for it. They pursued it without mercy, and they shot it down next to a hospital, which is part of the MOD's own avoidance policy. They shouldn't have even been there. Even if they were able to get an application, it would have been denied because of its location. It's in their avoidance policy. I've listed at least 20 aviation laws and laws for training over private land that they have broken in just a few short hours. This was in no way, no shape, no form an exercise. This was a real combat situation where the usual rules of the air do not apply. I don't know what else I can say to you to prove to you they did not adhere to their own rules and regulations that night. But this was not an exercise over private land, because they have ignored every opportunity, every rule, regulation, policy and standing order that there is. Now, I don't know if you would like me to read out some of the policies of training over private land. I found them very interesting. I've spent some time reading these this week, but they've certainly broken every rule in the book, and I can guarantee you that no application for training on private land ever existed. I don't know if you have any questions for me, or if you would like me to explain some of the documents to you. I do have a lot of them. Thank you, Armand. There is an awful lot of information to take in. Some of the rules and regulations are quite long. I pulled out the ones that were relevant to this case around low-level flying, that they weren't allowed to do in the areas that they did them, even in peacetime, and certainly not in an exercise. They had 20 military gunships, helicopter gunships, coming in from all directions to herd these objects up. They were here waiting and watching for it for 3 days and 3 nights before it arrived. Some people would say, well, this was to do with Exercise Chameleon. Exercise Chameleon was in Durham, 310 miles away. And with any exercise, it has to be planned, there has to be ministerial briefings, and it has to be submitted a minimum of 12 weeks before the exercise is due to start. And that's planned, that's in detail. So that's every vehicle that's involved, every aircraft that's involved, has to be at every route. It's all planned. But in that planning, there was no mention of South Wales. There was no mention of low-level flying, especially at night within silent hours. This was not an exercise. This was real life. And it involves us all. There is an awful lot of information. I have spent the best part of a week or so going through the Armed Forces Act to find the relevant parts. They are very chunky documents. The Training Over Private Land Act they are standing orders. You cannot negotiate them. You can't say, oh, I'm not going to do that, because it needs to be done in order for an application for training over private land. And of course, they can only train over private land if Ministry of Defence land is not available. And as I say, Sennybridge is 40 miles away, and it has 240,000 hectares of land. And there's a proportionality within the application for training over private land, and that is, it has to be cost effective. You know, the cost of getting to Ministry of Defence land exceeds what the object or the benefits sought are from this exercise. Well, I can't see that much more expense in going to Sennybridge than waking everybody up in the early hours of the morning over a residential area where they shouldn't have been. What they did that night was totally illegal. Totally illegal. And I hope that just by going through some of the rules and regulations that they have to abide by should tell you that what they did that night wasn't an exercise, because no application ever existed. Are there any questions for me? I know I've read out all of the acts that they have broken, all of the regulations that they have broken, but I do have them here. So if anybody would like me to clarify any of this, then I'm more than willing to do so. But what they did was a real situation. I saw it, so I know that it was a real situation, but I want you to know. You are my jury. You know, I've always asked you to be my jury, to make your own decisions, to look at this information. You know, I back it up with the facts. I think they took the UFO to RAF St Athan, where some of our leaders, including David Cameron, were here at St Athan by 7 o'clock that night at RAF St Athan on the 26th of February 2016. Yeah, Gary, we do have an awful lot of freedom of information requests still out there. They do tend to drag their heels. We're still waiting for one from South Wales Police from August of last year. So much for the 20-day time period. If they do not answer us this time, we will hold them in contempt and write to the Commissioner, and that's contempt of court. That makes them facing legal prosecution. Do more live shows. This is the first live show that I've done. I felt an obligation because I try to ignore a lot of the trolls and the debunkers. Some of the allegations that they have made are outrageous and quite hurtful, but I thank them for bringing this military exercise idea to me, because if they didn't, then I would never have investigated it. So I'm glad that they did, because it gave me the opportunity to prove that the Ministry of Defence broke every rule in the book. Might be human mutilations worth watching. Actually, when I went up to see Richard Hall, thank you for that, Armand, that was the show that he was doing, which was quite shocking for me, because I didn't know anything about this. I went to see him to tell him what had happened, hoping that he would do an investigation, and I had to sit through videos that showed human mutilations, and one was from a Romanian girl. She was about 16, 17 years old, that went missing the night before and was found the next morning. Horrific, absolutely horrific. But I'm not so sure that perhaps there aren't people closer to home that are responsible for that. Thank you, Cheryl. You know, I just want you guys to know the truth. I want you to know that in no way was that a military exercise. There are so many hoops they have to jump through, so much paperwork they have to do, and it all has to be signed off by different officers. There is no way, if the application was incomplete, that they had permission to do that over private land, which we know they didn't, thanks to National Resources for Wales and from the Rhondda Cynon Taf local authority, let alone the hundreds of people that called the police because they were woken up, didn't know what the hell was going on. There were farmers that were calling because they were worried for their livestock that night, because normally under an exercise situation, National Farmers Union are advised that they can tell their farmers that they can put their livestock in the barns overnight if an exercise is going to go on. But it certainly wouldn't happen over a residential area, and they are not allowed to do one over an area that has over 10,000 people in it. But they did that night, because this was real. This was a real military operation, a real combat operation, because they hunted those things down without mercy, and that appalled me, because I did not see or feel any hostility from them, but I did witness a lot from us. Do I feel that this object was man-made, new tech or something? Definitely not man-made. Someone actually brought this up to me in an interview quite recently. Did I think that perhaps it was our advanced technologies that was used in some kind of training exercise? If these were our advanced technologies, they'd have done this over Ministry of Defence land, not over a residential area, not over private land where the entire world can see them, you know. And as I said before, I'm yet to see us build a pyramid that can fly. We would need an awfully large building in which to keep that. These were not man-made. at all. I felt them scan me. I heard them communicate with me. These things were conscious and they had feelings. They were afraid. Kaz, what do you know about the rules that state about performing military exercise with the use of aircraft over a hospital that has a helipad like the Royal Glamorgan Hospital? Okay. Air ambulances have specific areas that they can land in. Okay, so on helipads at hospitals, no, not holographic. Thank you. So the helipad would already be a designated landing area. In the rural areas, there are certain fields that are already outlined for landing, but they have to get clearance from the CAA to be able to land there, and that would be done whilst in the air as a flight path. So initial permission, shall we say, from a landowner would have already been given in those circumstances. No, those things weren't holographic, Rich. They were real, Why and what was the significance of the area of Llantrisant? Just wondering why this happened in this area. That's a good question. Do you know there are some very ancient sites in Llantrisant, especially in Smilog Woods? There are a lot of kings and queens that were buried along the ridge there and seem to have some historical value to the Druids. I don't know if it was looking for a way out. We have had multiple sightings of very large craft over the Smilog Woods area, so I'm not so sure that there isn't some kind of portal connection there. Maybe it was looking for a way out. Why and what was the significance of the area of Llantrisant? Again, I don't know. There was some somebody put it out there that perhaps it was to do with the Royal Mint. Well, we sent a Freedom of Information request into the Royal Mint and they didn't know anything about it until the Welsh Extremist Counter-Terrorism Unit telephoned them to say that it was some kind of exercise. We asked for the CCTV from the hospital. We were denied. We were told that it didn't exist. Absolute drivel. We were denied. I'd like to know the history of the area, ley lines. Okay. Right, Armand, that's a very good question, because the field where this pyramid came in, it appears, because we've had a lot of esoteric investigations go on here as well, from sensitives and spirituous mediums and so on and so forth, dowsing and what have you, individually, so not all at the same time. And they've all pinpointed these energy areas, almost as if it would have had standing stones in that area at some point. And around this field are enormous stones that look like they've been dragged and cleared from that area. And I did put in the book that it resembled, or would have resembled, the stones of Clarke. But none of the other fields had these stones around them except this one field. And individually, people dowsing on one day, or spiritualists going in there with crystals, and and other people that just feel the energies, have highlighted exactly the same areas of these two rows of energy. And in one area, the energy goes one way, and immediately next to it, it goes the other way, almost like a way in and a way out. I don't know the significance of it, but it certainly looks like the land was cleared during Roman times for agriculture. Well, this is what we believe that the military were doing, Armand, when you say portal area. When the military came here and camped in the fields behind my house and lied about who they were and said that they were Vodafone, we do believe that they were actually triangulating a satellite into this area to block perhaps the resonance, the opening of this portal. We know that the United States Air Force and the British MOD have been monitoring for a frequency to know when these craft are going to appear, and thanks to Gary Jones, actually outed their iStar project, which is the satellites listen for the frequency that gets beamed to the E3 sentries, the E-3 sentries put it out to the smaller reconnaissance and surveillance aircraft, and then they come down closer to ground level to pinpoint where this frequency is strongest. And they actually use fast jets now. I think they learned some valuable lessons, and they definitely watched this case. Definitely. Yes, Gary, there are burial mounds, stone monuments, and much more in the area. It is in Smilog Woods, but again, nobody had permission to be in there and let off explosives. Nobody had permission to close the public footpaths, but they did. This was not an exercise. This was real life. The soldiers that were here were searching the fields, wearing forensic suits and those blue cover shoes on their feet. And again, the debunkers have said, yes, well, they have to clear their rubbish up. Yes, they do. But they don't have to dress up for that. I don't know what it was they were looking for, but they were looking for something specific. You know, hurry up, find it. They were looking for something. I don't know if something came off the top of that pyramid and perhaps was jettisoned into the fields. When that first green object came out, the green object, they shot down without a shadow of a doubt. They shot it down. Have there been any cattle or animal mutilations? Yes, Armand, there have. We had 4 ponies that were mutilated. The jaw strips were missing, tongues, eyes, ears missing, and they looked like they'd been dropped from a great height, because we don't have ponies here. We have cattle and we have sheep. There were 4 of them, and they were equally mutilated. Yes, and that happened in the May of the following year after this event. Farmer here has lost sheep to mutilations. He actually posted some photographs on our local village hall notice board to ask if anybody's dog did this. And when I looked, I thought, no, my dog can't use a scalpel, because the skin and the eyes had been removed surgically, which was really bizarre. And it does go on here, yes. According to Bunker, they reckon they were looking for a broken chain. Really? They make it up as they go along, don't they? So they'd need to put on forensic suits to find a broken chain. But the point is that the men and women that came and camped in the fields here, that were using ground penetrating radar amongst other equipment, there is no exercise ever listed for those people to this date, and there never will be. It was a covert operation, which is why they lied. If it were an exercise, they are duty bound to tell you who they are. Only in a covert operation wouldn't they? And they didn't. They lied about who they were, tried to cover their tracks, tried to say that they were Vodafone doing field research, when in reality they were a covert operation cleaning up after a huge UFO event. What else? Any more questions for me before I sign off this evening? I'll just flick back up through the comments. Wayne, I'll be a bit clearer about your rules about performing a military exercise with the use of aircraft over a hospital. The hospital is actually part of the exclusion zones. They're not allowed to do low-level flying next to a hospital. It's in the MOD's own avoidance policy. The same as they can't do it near a civil airport. But of course we've got Cardiff International Airport here, with a nice photograph of their Apache helicopter that had to do an emergency landing just after the explosion with its cockpit on fire. So they broke multiple rules, multiple aviation laws, all the rules and regulation regarding training over private land. There is no way that any application was ever made or granted, because it would have been incomplete, because they never had written permission from the landowner. and my computer had frozen for a while. I don't have any for you, Kaz. I know that you're telling the truth. There's no one that doubts you in my mind. Unfortunately, all of the debunkers are coming from one particular group, which shocks me because they're supposed to be a UFO group. I think there's a lot of jealousy. They're trying to make this about me. It is never and never will be about me. It's about getting the truth out. I can show you the regulations, I can show you the rules, the evidence. There's the Freedom of Information request that we've done, all of the evidence, and we're still pushing this investigation. It will never stop. Have you ever asked Vodafone for information on the date and place you saw them? Tim, I don't have to. We already know that they were military. You know, when we asked them who they were, the Ministry of Defence told us that they held no information within the scope of our request, and then when we asked what they were doing, we were told Section 26, not in the public interest. Well, only the military can hide behind Section 26, and we do actually have an admittance from the Ministry of Defence that they were military, and they were armed. You know, they didn't have yellow caps in the end of their gun, which again is an offence, unless it was a real situation. Did I ever suffer from any health problems after the sighting? Yes, I did, Cheryl. And initially they were very small things. I suddenly became allergic to a vitamin tablet I've taken my entire life. And not the tablet itself, but the coating of that tablet I became allergic to, which was really strange. And then I became anaphylactic. I was never anaphylactic before. And it accumulated really and culminated to New Year's Eve of 2016 going into 2017 when I nearly died. And it was then that I started to put all of these smaller things together and realised that this had all started since the event. My electoral dermal wave has changed. You know, my debunkers say, oh, this is a signal, she's supposed to have an alien signal. I never said that. I said my electoral dermal wave has changed, and it is constant and unchanging. And I don't know if it was because of the light that was shone on me from that craft or because I was scanned, but I didn't know about it until I took the polygraph test, and my polygraph examiner was completely shocked, just gobsmacked, and looked back over the test just to see this slow and constant signal inside of me, which is strange to see her physically shaking when she hadn't showed any emotion throughout all of the tests that I did. When the police were asked to close the pathways, what do they say about this? Okay. We asked the police why they closed the roads and the footpaths, and it took them nearly 3 years to get back to us. Initially, they said that it was a vexatious request, which was basically too much time or trouble to look into it. And Gary wrote back to them and said, I just think that any office clerk can do this, and it's just laziness. Eventually, 3 years later, we had an answer, and they said that they could find no information regarding any road closures or anything else that night, but the police officers involved have since left the organisation. Again, if they can't find any information, how do they know who was involved? You know, a councillor who lives in Tonnyrevel used Smilog Woods as a shortcut to go through to Llantrisant on a regular basis. It was a shortcut to get to work, and he was stopped by uniformed police going into Smilog Woods, and they had Smilog Woods closed off on one particular area for 3 days. Disgraceful behaviour coming from a UFO group. It is the same UFO group have photographs that they will not release from this night. They have primary witness statements they have never released for this case. It is outrageous, but there's nothing I can do about it. I would like their own members to ask them. I would like their own members to ask them why they are trying to debunk this case when they know that it's real. It's more about attacking me than getting the truth out. and all Gary Jones and I have ever done is tried to get the truth. And as I say, we are waiting for more information to come in from Freedom of Information requests. I will keep you posted as to what they say, bearing in mind they have to be very careful about what they say, because right now they can't confirm or deny anything without proving that they've lied. The UFO group are complicit. You know, it's a little bit worrying for me when one of the founders has friends in RAF St Athan who are members of the SAS. What does that tell you about that particular person? News on the video. It still hasn't, the Carl Winston witness still has not released the video because of the hateful things that have been said about me by the said UFO group. There are other videos that exist. We have been desperately trying to track down the witnesses. I may indeed go to Pentyrch and speak to some of the CEOs there to see if I'm able to actually address their staff and leave some cards there for people to contact me if they don't want to do it directly, because there is such a stigma around coming forward and such fear from people. I won't and refuse to be ruled by fear. I don't know how much longer they will allow me to talk, and I don't just mean tonight, I mean in general. And it is a sacrifice I made when I came forward, but no one's going to threaten my kids. No one. I'm not a star, Paul. I just want people to know the truth, that this was a real situation and not an exercise. No way, no how would they have ever been granted permission to do one there anyway, but there was no way that the application was ever completed. The press didn't know, the public didn't know, local government didn't know, National Resources for Wales didn't know, and certainly the farmers didn't know. So the application was never done. It wouldn't surprise me. Facebook interfere with an awful lot of things. I have not done an interview yet where there hasn't been technical issues. Anyway, guys, unless anybody has any questions for me, please look up those acts. I can tell you what they all are. I can put some things in the notes afterwards that will list them all. It seems the fear of ridicule is not filtered through yet, beaten in the mind. This is a new regime. Yes, it is. You know, when I have witnesses say that they won't come forward because they're afraid for their children, what about our children and their children's children? You know, what the military did that night was unjust and illegal. And they're doing this without our knowledge or consent. We're not even supposed to know these things exist. What have they done? What have they done that now requires us to have an armed Space Force? Requires us to have space-based weapons. Thank you, Gary, for posting that. Thank you, Paul. I just hope that you've taken on board tonight the number of regulations that were broken, the aviation rules, but more importantly, that they would never have been granted an application, and no application was ever made. And